You know me, Bill. There's something
Yep.
in my middle name. You see, that's a joke because you said it sounded ambiguous. All right. Well,
Off to a flying start after
well,
2.5 weeks.
as the popular people, the kings of podcasting say, we'll cut that all out. That we'll start the show now, Bill. How's
All
that?
right.
You were saying that you had indulged in quite a bit of pizza, which uh, you're in the research triangle area, if I
Yep.
remember, as they call it.
North Carolina.
Yeah, and so do you have some sort of specialty pizzerias there? Like what's sort of the hierarchy of like, good pizza there?
There's Randy's Pizza, and then there's everything else.
Mm. See, exactly. Like here, they're actually we had this sort of food blossoming, if you will, explosion in the 2000s in Austin. So there's all sorts of like boutique foodie things. But it used to be back in my day, they were basically two sources of unique pizza. There was Conan's, which is named after Conan the Barbarian, so you can imagine what they decorate their restaurants with, and then there was Mangia's, also a very creative name, whose iconic figure is a Godzilla figure they have everywhere. And Mangia's had the stuffed pizza, right? So you've got the dough on both sides with stuff in the middle, and then Conan's was just deep dish pizza.
Okay. Did you
So,
like Conan the Barbarian?
oh yeah,
That's one
Bill.
of my favorite movies of all time. I actually have
Well,
the soundtrack.
oh yeah, yeah. No, the soundtrack. I don't have the soundtrack, but I like the movie, and I guess there was also Red Sonja was the sequel, if I remember.
No,
And
Conan the Destroyer was the
oh, that's
sequel.
right. There's three of them. Yeah, yeah. I remember all three of those movies, and I particularly like the sort of 8 by 10 comic books that used to come out. I used to read a lot of those, and to this day, every now and then, I still read the Conan short stories, which there's a lot of like books of my youth that I try to read every now and they're not very good. Particularly those like D&D novels. Do you ever read those? Those
No.
are those are not very good. But the Conan ones are pretty good. They're not too shabby. So speaking of being a barbarian exploring the hinterlands, you've been on a lot of trips recently, huh?
Yep. I was in Austin 2 weeks ago. Then I was in New York City and upstate last week. I guess those were the only two trips. And
Yeah.
it'd be interesting to hear your definition of upstate, because for me, upstate is anything outside of New York City. But people who are actually from like real upstate think that that's different.
Yeah, that's been my impression. I mean, my impression of New York, the state, is that there's New York City, the with its five boroughs way there in the south, and then there's rest of New York, or Ronnie, Rony,
Right.
which I'm sure it's just like in people's impressions of Texas, right? That we all have horses and cowboy hats. It's all just
And guns.
yeah, and guns, highfalutin nonsense. But sure. Although, I did have the chance yesterday, speaking of traveling, I drove all the way up to Dallas and back, which is like a 3-hour journey each way, which is fine. And we have a this lady, Wendy Davis, running for governor. And I think once you got about an hour and a half outside of Austin, there every now and then there would be this billboard that said "Wanted." Wendy Davis's files, FBI investigating, and it was delightful. I'm here in the bubble of Austin, very liberal, and it turns out that the rest of Texas is not so. So it's good to be reminded of that.
Right. You know what would be cool? If I make a really good point, you should take your two six-shooters off of your little belt there and fire them in the air.
That's a good idea, and I think I might need to get some more ammunition for all the good points that you'll be making.
Yep.
So who did you visit on these trips? Like, you've been telling me like various people you've been visiting. It seems like you're doing some sort of like field work to
Yeah.
discover what's going on out there.
Well, the trip to Austin was to the IBM Austin site. We have this twice yearly leadership meeting with the general managers and some of the senior technical people, and we sort of try to catch everybody up on key goals and stuff like that. And this one was really focused on the design work and then the DevOps work. And so I led a pretty fun panel on DevOps with some people from really different perspectives, different disciplines like design and product management and engineering. We had some people from recent acquisitions like Cloud and Fiberlink, and then some old-time IBMers. and it was a really fun
Mm.
panel. And then, oh, sorry, you were going to say something?
Oh, no, no, no. Go ahead.
Okay. And then last week, we had I went to New York City. Well, yeah. So early in the week, we were in Brooklyn to visit some friends. So we visited Eric Kastner at Kickstarter in Brooklyn. And then on Wednesday, we visited Rafe Coburn and John Allspot at Etsy. And then on Thursday and Friday, we were at the IBM headquarters to um, show our summer intern project, the Extreme Blue
Oh,
project, and that was fun. And our CEO Ginny stopped by on Friday, so it was kind of fun to chat about the project with her.
sure. That sounds nice. So, there's a couple of things. Like, so in that you had a DevOps panel, like any good analyst, I'm basically looking for other people's ideas that I can dress up in my own like fancy clothes and put my name on. And so I was thinking this week, I should really sit down and write a piece that just like is what is DevOps from a very like uh, broad point of view. So I'm curious, Bill, when you're on your DevOps panel, I'm sure you took a stab at explaining what DevOps is, right?
Uh, Not exactly. And Mike Lukides from O'Reilly, he's actually written that article twice. He wrote it like 2 years ago, What is DevOps? And then recently he wrote What is DevOps Revisited? So you may want to check that one out if you haven't seen it. But basically, the way I started the panel was sort of talking about the narrow view. Remember, I think I talked about this in the podcast. I ran into my friend and he said, "Hey, I'm adopting DevOps." And I said, "Great, what are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, I automated my deployment." And I said, "Yep. And then what?" And he said,
Yeah,
"What do you
yeah.
mean?" I just told you I'm adopting DevOps.
Yeah, no, it's funny you put it that way because I had
Uh-oh. Did you freeze?
I had lunch with with the local DevOps guy here in Austin diagram, but sort of some circles of like what's agile versus DevOps, and it was a fun sort of like way to while away 30 minutes over some sandwiches to kind of figure out the difference between the two. But he had some interesting sort of takes on it. I mean, so it's sort of essentially true to the name. You can do all this agile development stuff, but until you start considering operational concerns and baking it into it and think about what's happening when your software is running, you're sort of kind of doing more agile than just DevOps, if you will, which is fun. Which throw out another thing, right? Like when I always try to grossly oversimplify something and come up with some easy filters, and one of them was that it seems like in my hyperbolic way of phrasing things, pretty much unless you have an application that is highly network enabled, you're probably not doing DevOps. Or not that you're not doing it, but it doesn't necessarily apply. Or you don't need to do it, right? So like, and there's a few like I'll give three examples. One of them sort of like a curveball, right? One of them is sort of like let's say I have a desktop application, whether it's a mobile app or a traditional desktop, and it in no way connects to any sort of network. Like, so sure. I mean, you can do iterative development and all this kind of stuff from Agile, but you kind of sort of don't need dev. You don't necessarily need DevOps, right? And then like take a second example of like I have a web application or a mobile app that is highly connected, right? There you go. You might need DevOps, and you might have another example which I thought was interesting is like, well, what about a web browser? Right? Like a web browser is it exists only for the network, but I'm not sure it sort of like needs DevOps, if you will, right? And so, anyways, it was just an interesting framing to kind of explore an unanswerable question, but it was fun to waddle through all of that.
Yeah, the way I kind of use it more as I use the term as a tool more than an actual thing.
Mm,
So I was talking to Allspa about this because he gets annoyed by sort of like the abuse of DevOps, just like people abuse the Agile stuff. But I actually find it to be a useful tool because it's nice and short and it's got cachet. And
yeah.
so if somebody might walk up to you and say like, "Hey, what's this DevOps stuff?" and it can start a conversation, or they could say, I'm doing DevOps, and it can start a conversation, even if their mental model of what it is completely different from yours.
Right.
And also, I mean, it just, people write blog articles on, this is a DevOps practice we're adopting. So I kind of think of it as more of like the kind of the center of a, what are those things used? The meme maps or the idea maps or something?
Mind maps.
Mind maps. Yeah, I think of it as just sort of like the center of the mind map, and the actual DevOps thing doesn't matter at all, but it's useful for kind of like pulling in other ideas just because people know the term and are interested in the term.
Yeah, yeah. No, as I'm sure you can interpret from my roundabout way of talking, that's pretty much how I treat reality as a whole. Everything is just a mechanism to make things a little more clear, but
Right.
but not really like precise and definitive. But yeah, yeah, it is like I don't know. It'll be fun to like sit down and actually try to come up with some cogent like 1,500 word piece on it. But it is more like I think the it's funny, like all this stuff you learn when you're sort of like going from like a young programmer to an old one that you used to think was nonsense, you kind of start falling back on when you're older, right? So for example, it's more easier and I think helpful to talk about DevOps in terms of the benefits and abilities it gives you instead of, trying to define something precisely, right?
Yeah.
And it is like, when I was a younger person, I hated that kind of talk. Like I wanted to know like the technology and like the tools and all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, it's just like, yeah, what does this thing do for me? And I think that's the approach that becomes more beneficial in something like DevOps. And why I was going over this, three different application types is like, well, to your point, this is sort of like the center of a big mind map, and like there's all these things that might be helpful if you want the things they help you with to be tautological about it. So I don't know. We'll see how it sorts out. But how was the so in that you were talking about these things on a panel, how was the audience reception? Like have you had this conversation with enough people now that you kind of have a list of like a FAQ, the sort of common questions and topics that come up?
Yeah, we have a fact, but I mean, I guess in terms of the audience reception, it's really hard. Like, there's a couple things that are hard about a panel like that. The first thing is that people who you tend to ask to be on the panel have thought about it pretty deeply. And so, for one thing, it's very easy for them to speak in abstract terms, which are completely accurate, and like people who are fairly advanced will understand exactly what they mean. But if you don't have experience with it, it's just boring and meaningless.
Right.
And then the other thing is just sort of um, it's hard to it's hard to describe the getting started approach and the kind of getting from here to there approach if you're like 3 years into your own adoption. And
Yeah.
so a lot of the people in the audience, they've heard of DevOps, and maybe they're doing one or two things that people associate with DevOps, but they're not very deep in it. And so it's kind of hard for the experts to work backwards and make it consumable for the beginners. I mean, obviously, like somebody like Ernest or Allspa, who like talks to people about DevOps all the time, probably have pretty standard techniques for sort of talking to the DevOps 101. But
Yeah.
one of the complaints was that our panel was kind of like a DevOps 301 instead of 101, and went kind of past some of the audience members. But I think for the folks in the audience who have some experience with it, I think they got a lot out of it because of the different perspectives.
Yeah, no, that'd be interesting. I'd be interested to get your take on. There's a presentation that a couple of DevOps guys, including Ernest, gave at the Agile conference week before last, and it was over DevOps metrics, and to the point of finding a possible to understand entrance into abstract thinking. Metrics are a double-edged sword as always, but they're an interesting way of doing it, right? Because it's like a concrete thing that you can kind of go over. So I'll have to put a link to that in the show notes, but it seemed like it was one of these like, ponderous 70 slide things with a bunch of single pictures, which is fine. But they're actually there were several slides in there that were like interesting metrics that I need to go look back and see if they're kind of applicable. Because that's the other thing that I want to write sometime soon is like maybe it won't be metrics, but it's basically I think it will be metrics because that's again an approachable thing is to say like so here are some metrics to start guiding your way with, right? Like they may end up being crap, but it's like if you're driving a car in one direction, it's nice to know how fast you're going and how long you've gone. And that may in no way determine like the point of you driving around, but it's good to start with something. And I don't know, it'd be interesting to like solicit from a lot more people like what metrics or metric they actually use to track things, or how they think about that kind of tracking, if you will.
Yeah, I was just looking for this thing. We did an internal discussion on DevOps with one of our divisions, and I asked about 10 questions to kind of seed the discussion. Let me just find it really quick.
And it does like in order to buy you time for clicking, like as you were going over doing the 101 version of the course, like I've you know our son is almost 5 years old now, and he's into that phase where he much like his dad, he can not successfully but equivocate doing anything away. He can explain like, well, I don't want to do that, and so I've been trying to figure out how to get him to do simple things like clean your room, right? And and it's almost like I'm starting to. My new theory is that just like I've been taking too much of a 301 approach and be like, well, you clean your room by picking things up and putting them in the toy box. But I think maybe he doesn't understand that, right? And it's almost like and again, this is all about like culture change and educating things, right? Like as an expert or even intermediate person who understands something, it can be really painful to like explain how to do something to someone, like cleaning a room. And like so what I find myself doing is one, repeating myself over and over again. And that takes a lot of discipline on my part not to have my head explode. But just sort of like saying like, well, you pick up this toy and walk over there and put it in there. Like, I mean, it's almost like you have to walk someone literally or metaphorically through doing something so they experience it on their own. And I found in the past that a lot of learning Baroque technical things is often like that, where it's sort of like for example, when a programmer gets on a team, sometimes one of the first things they do is fix bugs, and it's just like kind of annoying and not too interesting, but it just sort of forces you to get into the code and figure things out, if you will. So I don't know. It is like one day I'll crack the code of just having my son clean his room without me having to explain the mechanics of it.
Yep. So I found my thing. So basically what it was like I had to assume an audience of several thousand people who hadn't, who would have very different experience levels with the DevOps stuff. And so what I did was I sort of provided my view, which I didn't claim was right, just sort of my view. And I guess that's another problem about discussing these sorts of topics. There's never, a one-size-fits-all answer. The right answer is always kind of it depends on your context, but that's never helpful. So then you actually have to go into the actual context. So here's how I gave my view. So first I had some culture points, and basically I asked some binary questions. So the first one, can your developers deploy to production? To me, the right answer is yes. Are your developers on call for incidents? Again, yes. Do your sysadmins understand the intent of the code in production? Yes. Do your testers write automated tests? Yes. Do your product managers deploy experiments? Yes. Have you hugged your compliance focal point lately? Yes. Could you drop everything and deliver something completely new in a week? Yes. And then John Allspaw gave me a couple that were pretty good, but they're no. So do you attribute outages to human error? No. Do you believe in a single root cause of incidents? No. And then for practices I had, can you push a button and run a full regression test? Yes. Can you push a button and deploy to production? Yes. Can you deploy more than 5 times a day? Yes. Can you measure the technical and business impact of a feature? Yes. Can you measure impact on a feature before it's done, in air quotes? Yes. Can you run a controlled experiment to test a business or design hypothesis? Yes. And so obviously that's kind of a much deeper list of things than simply, I've automated my deployment.
Yeah, no, those are great. I mean, because they're very specific, right? Like, and they also they thread that annoying needle I was referencing that I hated when I was younger. Is they don't actually tell you, they don't prescribe how to do it. It's just like here's an end state that you should get to, and they're also it's like you sent over that digital playbook thing, right? And I haven't. It's if you go to playbook.cio.gov, and it's like, holy crap, this is almost like the perfect guide for consulting. Like, because if you read through it, a lot of it rotates around like I was looking up some articles to see what the the pedigree of it, the reason, the history of it is or whatever, but it is sort of like solve problems that people have. I mean, I'm grossly simplifying it, and like, and focus on solving the problem for the person, and like
Right. Buy
assign.
low, sell high.
That's right. Like, assign someone, one individual, to be in charge and responsible for the project, and it gets back to that thing like, well, just clean your room. It's like, well, I don't know what you mean, clean my room. Like, what do you mean build like a health insurance application system for 200 million people? Well, just do that. It's just, it's almost like you had to go back to these, like, here's how you tie your shoes things for people who don't know how to tie their shoes, because like, why would you know how to tie your shoes? It's a crazy thing to assume. Anyways, but no, those 10 things you're going through are great. Like, I'll have to get a copy of that so I can build on them, as we say in the business.
Yeah, I
But
could
but
just email it to you.
and so to that end, like, you said you were visiting like Kickstarter and Etsy and things like that. Like, I mean, I don't know a non-silly way to ask this question, but like, is it evident that they like do all of those things? Like what's it like when you walk into a shop and you're like, whoa, this looks like it's a healthy operation, or to ask it another way, well, what problems do they have? Like if they're doing all this other stuff in a good way, like what do they get stressed out about?
Yeah, well, I mean, we visited each one for like 4 hours and had chats with some of their senior people, and I think it's really impossible to go deep, even with
Sure.
4 hours with senior people. The one kind of insight I gained on that was John Allspa let me sit in on their weekly ops meeting, which was a lot of fun. So basically, they were just kind of going through the various ops issues that they had. And I told him after the meeting, like, as much as I admire Etsy, it was kind of reassuring to know that they have unsolved problems.
Yeah. No, that's another thing that like I've been reflecting on in the difference between the white collar world that I've existed in for many years now and the programming world that I used to, and or more of the lowercase engineering world. And it seems like, going back to one of those things in the playbook, there's a certain amount of squishy accountability in the white collar world that can exist in the engineering world, but kind of doesn't, right? Because in the engineering world, it's sort of like the tests pass or they don't pass, or the code works or it doesn't work, or you like are overtime or you're not overtime. Like, it's all kind of obvious, like what's going on. Whereas in the white collar world, and let me stop. And as a consequence, in the engineering world, it seems like when you have your weekly review meeting, it's expected that you'll have done the work. Right? Like, or it's expected that you'll be called upon at a team level or an individual level to kind of report on how things have been going. And the kind of like mealy mouthed mumbling answer of like, oh yeah, I'm still working on that, isn't really acceptable. But it seems like, and maybe I've just worked at terrible places, but in the white collar world, like, no one's really ever that precise. Like, there's never really like, yep, I'm done on that. It's like 40% done. We've got this stuff happening, and then the project will be finished. And it is like, that's one of the main things that makes me pine for the engineering days, is like this certainty of each individual reporting on the progress on their project. But I bring all of this up because, like, am I making that notion up, Bill? Like, or am I like glossing over like this past that I'm no longer in? Is it actually that sort of like responsible?
Yeah, I don't think it is. I mean, like,
Well, that's a reassuring answer.
yeah, with well, one comment about the Etsy meeting. So the one thing I enjoyed the most was the atmosphere. Like, everybody was really constructive with everything they said. Like, when there were questions, there were questions to gain insight, not to kind of point fingers or anything like that. And so
Yeah.
the atmosphere was just this really collegial, constructive, positive atmosphere, just very friendly, and I really appreciated that. But to your point about, like, is something done or not, I actually find that as one of the main anti-patterns is when people get too focused on finish dates, because it can drive a lot of dysfunction. So, like, my approach is that when I ask people for estimates, they're just estimates, and it's so I can give forecasts. And depending on what I know about the person, I may challenge the estimate if they tend to be over optimistic. But it's not
Yeah.
to it's it's actually sort of the opposite. Some people challenge the estimate to actually try to do something more aggressive to push the people. But really, what I'm more interested in is sort of forecasting the stakeholders. I guess the only way I'd push back on an estimate is if my inspection of the work seems to indicate that they're overachieving, because sometimes there's a degree of overachieving as opposed to the simplest possible thing. But
Yeah.
ultimately, when it comes to a status meeting, if somebody's not done, I'll certainly ask why, just understand if there are any kind of latent failures or blockers that they need help with. But if the answer is that the task turned out to be more complex than they thought, the only thing I'm interested there is just learning about sort of the misunderstanding of the complexity so we can do better in the future. But it's, I don't really have any expectation. Oh, you said it was going to be done Wednesday and it's not done. You're a bad person.
Right. No, no. I think that's another thing. It's always interesting to see how engine software developer culture it tends to be pretty mature in that aspect of like forecast estimating how long something is going to take is not really accurate. is not like 100% accuracy thing that you might depend on. But it is like going back to that playbook, right? Like one of the things I thought was interesting was the what do they say? Play 12. Use data to drive decisions. and and that is like it is in this like post Moneyball big data era of thinking where we're all people are supposed to be data driven and stuff. It is like that's another one of those foggy mysteries I'm always curious about is like how much data do people actually use to drive decisions? Because again, in the software development world, you can have like data on anything you want because you have programmers who would more than happily like generate reports for you and all the stuff you have throws out data and things like that and as I'm sure you would say, what becomes important is focusing on the right data, but it always does contrast sharply with again my experience in more of the white collar world where there's not really like I don't see people using data a lot, to kind of inform what's going on or to figure out, we were talking about metrics earlier. And so to that end, I'm also curious, like when were visiting these other people or you're doing DevOps within IBM, like, do you feel like you're following Play 12? Are you using a lot of data to drive decisions, like project management wise and otherwise, or is it sort of like what's the reality of doing that?
Well, I think it's just a maturity curve like anything else. Some people haven't started. Other people are extremely advanced. Like with Etsy, experimentation is a fundamental part of their toolbook. And like when I was there last week, Rafe showed us that he just went to the website and they had 60 experiments running in parallel. And when they define an experiment, they actually have tools to help them understand how long it has to run given the parameters like percentage of population and stuff like that to gain statistical significance to know that it's actually a valuable experiment that you can learn from. So I think it's just the maturity curve there. I think in general the really high-end data-driven stuff we're very early in the maturity curve. I think there's a few pioneers like Amazon and Google and Etsy and Facebook that are at the very high end. But I think for most companies doing development, they're either not started or very very early days and immature.
Yeah. And like in the instances that you've seen, so who consumes this data? Is it only the engineering people or the business side or like who's using it?
Well, I think in the best cases, you've got the interdisciplinary teams just as a kind of a creative community. So like the product management, the engineers, and the designers, and they're all using data as kind of a backplane to help foster discussions and talk about outcomes. Like I know with the Service Engage website we were doing for the SaaS products, we have this really nice model that talks about the particular funnel for Service Engage, and then has key metrics between each node in the funnel, and then we just kind of use that as a kind of a centerpiece of any discussion, so we can objectively. We could have a more objective view on our theories about why
Right.
something's working or not working. So I think having that simple shared model backed by pretty good data is an incredibly valuable tool. Like you could actually go a little bit bonkers and have way too much data, which just kind of overwhelms you. So I think there's like the ideal case is that you've got extremely rich, large data collection, but funneled into a couple of models that are very revealing and that are sort of a centerpiece of the collaborative community and are continuously refined to be more useful and more usable.
So then let me ask you one other extremely open-ended question before we move on to other topics. So like in talking with these groups of folks and your own experience, do you, do you think like would you say that the engineering team like or let me put this another way, how much time do you find the engineering team spend on like understanding the business and the customers and like what the core thing is they're doing, right? Like so for to answer my own question before you answer, right? Like it seems like if I'm working at Etsy or even Kickstarter, like it's really easy for me to understand the business, right? Like especially at Etsy, in theory, there could actually be all these complexities that I don't know about, but it's kind of easy to understand what it is I'm writing software for. But the larger an organization gets, you might be more removed from understanding what sort of like the core business is. And so I wonder like if in order to be sort of successful in kind of like an agile DevOps kind of mindset, like how important it is to understand the core business, if you will.
Yeah, I think it's super important because it kind of comes back to the feedback loop. Like one of the challenges with coming from the on-premises enterprise world is that the feedback loops are so disconnected from the work you do. So like when let's say it was 2008 and we just shipped RTC Rational Team Concert 1.0 after a 3-year release cycle, and then we're starting another year release cycle for Team Concert 2.0. If I write a line of code on day one of that release cycle, probably in a normal enterprise adoption case, I won't get first feedback on it for 18 to 24 months. So how
Right.
the heck do I know if that line of code, well, I mean, not the line of code, but the feature, whatever, how do I know if that's good or not? I don't. And so I think that's one of the reasons that SaaS is kind of taking over. Well, I mean, people talk about the operational cost versus the capital expenditure and stuff like that. But another thing is just the rapid feedback loops. If you can get feedback on new features hours or days after you code them, and you're able to kind of map that to iteratively improving design to lead to happier and more successful users, you're going to win. Simple as that.
Yeah, yeah. No, so speaking of design, I think you updated your LinkedIn page recently. Since you tipped me off that it's always special projects, I try to keep up with that. So what's your new special project, Bill?
Yeah, well, I joined the IBM design group under Phil Gilbert last week, and basically, it's to it has to be a little bit vague, but we've been on this design transformation. Well, it's been kind of funny. There's been two transformations going on in parallel. One is this kind of design and product management transformation to be much more user-centric as opposed to buyer-centric. You know, the whole thing about
Right.
are you selling to the CIO or the developer? So we're trying to be much more user-centric, and that's really taking hold. And on the other side, there's been this kind of grassroots transformation around the DevOps ideas, which we can't define. but all those sorts of things I lump in with DevOps. And basically, what we're trying to do is bring those two efforts together because they're highly complementary. The design thinking thoughts and the DevOps thoughts. They both really value the interdisciplinary collaboration. They both value the feedback loops. But what we kind of see is that they bring different tools and different perspectives to the problem-solving process. Hang on, my iPhone's going off. Let me just silence it. So like for instance, feedback loops, the design thinking folks, they have a number of tools to get user feedback. Like an example is a paper prototype. So you might have a 4-hour session with some users who are representative of the types of users who you want your product to be great for. And in the course of a couple of hours, you might make a series of paper prototypes that imagine a product and then
Right.
get feedback from the user on, does it meet their needs, et cetera. You could also, code up the feature, dark launch it to production, do an A/B test with, tens of thousands of users, measure their usage to get feedback that way. Which one is the right technique? Well, they're both valid techniques. One is kind of lower, it's much lower cost, much faster, but somewhat lower fidelity in what it tells you because people are biased when they're actually know they're being observed. whereas the other one is more costly to implement but much more precise in what it tells you about the actual user behavior. So basically, all we're trying to do is kind of harmonize those two kind of thinking approaches to create much better products. And so I'm basically kind of responsible for the engineering and the DevOps aspects of that. And then it's not sort of a chief philosopher role. It's basically working with our like top 10 or 15 projects in the company to have a good result.
So I've visited that the Austin Design Lab a few times, and what struck me is a like I'm old because most everyone here is like 20 something, and b a lot of the at least the design people that I came across are like I don't I don't really know how to characterize them, but they're like different. like they're definitely not like engineers or like product managers or I don't know, the other sorts of things you would encounter in the tech world. And so like I assume you've hung out with these people quite a bit. Like I mean, how in your mind, like how are you starting to characterize design people?
Well, I mean, they're arranged. It's just like engineering. Engineering's kind of
Sure.
like a super class, and then you have subclasses like programmer, sysadmin, or tester, or
Build
whatever.
manager.
Right, exactly. And in the DevOps world, those roles kind of blur, and you have more kind of general purpose people who have focus areas, but tend to wear more than one hat. I guess what I'm learning about the design aspects is it's similar. People might be called a designer, but one might be very geared towards the visual and interaction design, like basically how to make the pixels beautiful on the screen, whereas another might be a user researcher who actually has deep skills in research methodology, running controlled experiments
Hmm.
to get to the heart of what users need, not necessarily what they say they want, because the two are usually different. So they have a sort of a broad set of disciplines underneath a general design discipline. But the ones that we've hired are just really excellent. Like one thing I think Phil's done a great job at is really going after some great design talent from some of the top universities. So they bring in just a ton of energy and expertise and smarts, and they're just really reinvigorating to work with.
And like so another thing that's always fun is like I feel like in the developer culture, we've sort of been like armchair designers for a long time, right? Like I'm
Yeah,
sure I'm sure all of us have like
and the world is unfortunate for it.
exactly. And best case scenario, we have like a few Tufty books next to some Knuth books, like both
Yeah,
that no one actually ever really
yeah,
reads.
both collecting dust.
Right, exactly. And so in situations like that, when like the armchair whatever encounters like the actual professional, right? Like I'm always curious, like not so much like the armchair person finds out how they're wrong at all, but it's sort of like, oh, I understand how that fits together now, right? Like, because someone who's like formally trained in design probably is like, oh yeah, that Tufty guy is cool, but let me tell you everything that happened over the past 30 years,
Right.
right? Like there's almost this acceleration of new things that happen. Like, you know, for example, the paper prototyping thing, which had sort of infected its not infected in a good way, had sort of like reached its way into the developer world through like remember balsamic and wire mockups and all this stuff. Like there was kind of a culture of that for a while, but like I mean, are there any like now that you've hung out with designers for a while, are there any sort of like interesting new things that you've picked up from them that like that even if it seems obvious once you learn it, like you hadn't really thought of? And so, for example, I'll give you one example. Like I remember reading that Johnny Ive book, right? Like one of the big things that was interesting about the day-to-day work of a designer is like how much time they just spend on prototyping, right? Like just like weeks and weeks and months just like prototyping stuff and trying things out, which was like is interesting. I mean, software developers do that too. Like they compile, see if it works, rewrite it, compile, see if it works. Like, you're always doing this, but I don't know if I'd really thought of designers as just kind of like sitting there for months on end, just like trying different things out.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. The one kind of general approach that they tend to use that I wasn't really familiar with, but it seems kind of obvious in hindsight, is that they've got this term ideation. and it's basically about how do you create a bunch, or how do you capture a bunch of different. I hope no designers are listening to this. Here's Bill the engineer's informal interpretation of what ideation is. It's
Right.
basically getting a bunch of people to provide their own input in kind of a semi-isolated way, so that then you can kind of sort of like a brainstorm, collect it without being biased, and then harvest the patterns, make connections that might have been non-obvious until you put stickies on a sticky board. So
Right.
there ends up being a lot of boards and stickies, and people writing little notes on stickies and putting the stickies on the board. Whereas the approach that I'm more used to is you get a couple of smart people in the room and they talk about a feature or something, and then you're very eager to start writing the code for the feature. But with that approach, you kind of, a dominant personality, or simply the person who's, most awake that day, may drive the conversation a certain way,
Right. Right.
and then it kind of leads to, code being written. And unlike stickies, code never dies. Code is like cockroaches. So once code is written, it's going to be there for a long time. I mean, you may not think it's going to be there. It's like, oh, we're going to change this in a month, and then 5 years later you see it and you laugh and you say, I remember when I wrote that and thought I was going to change that in a month.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I mean, to have a weird out of left field thing like, we have a lot of highways down here in Texas, and oftentimes you'll drive by like a spaghetti bowl interchange, and there'll be sort of like this ramp that goes nowhere. It's just sort of like I always feel like the reason it exists is they were building this interchange, and they had some money, and they're like, well, one day we're going to finish this out, and so they build this ramp that doesn't go anywhere, and like it seems like more often than not that ramp is never finished. And to your
Right.
point, right? Like if you're sort of ideating, as it were, in code, for whatever reason, like it's really hard to just get rid of code. Like once you put a feature in, or once you put some code in, there's almost this supernatural pull to like keep it around and never
Right.
get rid of it, which that yeah, that no, that's an interesting insight. I didn't really thought of that. And it is like, it does always seem cheesy from a software developer perspective to like do all this post-it notes stuff. Right? Like it's just like, that's great whiteboarding. Like, but that doesn't result in anything. But I think you pointed out the reason that you spend so much time doing it is when you're, well, I would pro-offer the theory that when you and those other smart developers are in that room, there's not really a question of what the feature is. It's more of a discussion of the best way to implement it. And best has many different meanings depending on your schedule, budget, and skills and everything. But it's sort of like this debate of like, how do we do this? Whereas like I would imagine a lot of what happens with the post-it notes is like, what is the feature? And you're trying to come up with what that feature is in the first place, which you need much more. You need a lot less off ramps that go nowhere.
Yeah, well, I think I put it slightly differently. So in the kind of the classic engineering focused way, there's a problem. You probably don't really crisply understand it, and then but you're eager to make progress on it. And then because you got a bunch of smart people together, you jump to a particular conclusion, and then you code it. And then even though you meant to kind of circle back to think about different approaches, you have to move on to the next thing, and it's just sort of there.
Yeah.
Like we had an interesting case. It was actually really funny because like I was talking about the data driven maturity curve or whatever. So on the Service Engage project that I just finished, we didn't start with the web analytics and stuff on day one. We sort of started on it in like day 200 or something, just because we were relatively immature and had various project pressures. When we started doing it, we actually found a major usability bug that we didn't even know existed that was sort of critical to the business success of the application. But when we were coding that thing, we were certain that the design we came up with was great. But because we didn't have the feedback loops and because we hadn't explored other alternatives, it turned out that we were just deluding ourselves. But
Right.
we were so certain it was right, and it kind of makes me regretful. Like how many features have I implemented over the years where I was certain it was brilliant because I'm brilliant, but it actually could have been way better if I'd used some of these other techniques. And so I think one of the reasons I have a good collaboration with the design folks is that even though I've had some good successes, I also recognize places where I could have done a lot better. And it seems like the ideas and the techniques they bring to the table address some of the areas where I failed in the past. And so that plus the fact that they're just really smart and high energy, it makes me want to give them the benefit of the doubt that if we collaborate in a, the true sense of collaboration, like working together to make a product, it'll have a much better outcome than if we, kind of do it in the old way, in the silos and the engineering driven way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It'll be fun to see what that design group comes up with, because the breadth of exciting enterprise problems that IBM addresses is massive, and it's almost like applying that type of design thinking to it is a you know fun videos and IBM hiring out all sorts of design people over its 100-year history aside, right? Like in recent times, there hasn't been an extensive take on design in the enterprise space, which will be enjoyable to watch. And then you guys have that IBM Apple partnership as sort of like a pull to do that, or like a set of projects, if you will. So I don't know. It'd be interesting to see. It's and also to like close out the topic and wrap up, unless you have more to go over. It's interesting. There's another. So we've gone over kind of like two schools of process thought, and one of them being the process that developers or engineers follow, which is like, here are requirements, and we're going to come up with a good way of implementing those requirements and a good way of solving that problem. And part of that process is like, we don't always really know what the problem is, and in solving it we kind of like figure out the problem and also redefine it, and then we can iterate and do all sorts of different things, right? And then there's like the designer process, which is like, what becomes critical is really understanding, it's almost unmasking what the naive problem is, and really defining well the requirement, and the best way from an end user perspective that you solve that problem, and like how you think about what the problem is and how people want to interact with it and solve it, and like you spend a lot of attention on the human side of it. And there's another school of like process that I vaguely understand, but when I was at Dell in strategy, I would encounter a lot, and that's like the management consulting process, which is like a completely different. It's almost like management consultants are like business hackers, and they kind of show up and they're given like a very vague project and requirements, like figure out how we can sell more widgets in Tennessee. See you later. And like the job of a management consultant is to basically come up with what they think is the best fit solution for doing that, right? And then also and the large management consulting people, the way to profit in management consulting is you kind of come up with they're not patented necessarily, but you come up with a repeatable process for doing that. Like, you're basically like a very focused learning organization and team, right? You get sent into this organization. You have to explore, like, well, what is the widget? Why do people buy the widget? What do people need in Tennessee? Why are we not meeting those goals? What capabilities does the business have to actually sell these widgets and then sell them in Tennessee? And you've got to like learn all of that and then kind of come up with a conclusion, and therefore you should do the following, which is like, it's not exactly like the other two processes we were defining, but it's kind of fascinating to try to peel back the process that management consulting uses, because at its core, it's very similar to the other two in that it's basically like, we need to really define what the problem is and then figure out exactly what you can do to make the situation better. And it's continually like learning and trying to figure things out to come up with an answer, not just like, oh, I need to type up 500 words that describe something that's happening, that kind of like give the report about what happened last quarter.
Right. Yeah. The way I think about it is, whenever you talk to a user or customer, they usually tell you what they want. And then the challenge is to figure out or to kind of use that as a starting point, not as an end point, and kind of work back to what they need and then deliver what they need. And usually it's related to what they think they want, but different.
Right. Exactly. There's probably a whole other process school of thought called wedding planner. I think I overheard someone in a hotel lobby up in Dallas going over some wedding planning, and they were talking about having silent discos and all sorts of things, and it was like, it was interesting to like, we've both had weddings before, so been through the planning stages. Like, it is you have to basically find the little engineer in your head and inject them with horse tranquilizers, and then your wedding planning goes fine. instead of like wanting to optimize everything and solve problems. But yeah, that'll be fascinating. Well, on that odd note, do you have anything else you want to go over this week, Bill?
Not this week, but maybe a forward pointer to the next one. So I tweeted that I finished this book that John Allspod recommended called Behind Human Error, second edition, and I think it's probably
Still
the
more error.
yeah. Yeah, honest to God, though, it's probably the best book I've read in the past 5 to 10 years. Like
Really?
it was
And what's
just,
so great about it?
well, it kind of merits a longer discussion. But it's one of those books where, like, if you actually did highlight every part you found insightful, it would have like less highlighted text than, or sorry, it would have less
Right.
unhighlighted text than it had highlighted text, and it just really was kind of, it really helped me understand some of the phenomena I've experienced in my career, but didn't really understand the underlying forces.
That sounds
So
good.
anyway, it's a really hard book to read because it's just so dense and so full of ideas. And it took me probably like 20 or 30 hours because it's one of those books where you have to, read every paragraph twice to make sure
Right,
you really
right.
got it. And but I'd really recommend it to people. Behind Human Error. I guess you could probably get it done in 2 weeks. So if you're feeling ambitious, read it between now and next time
So
because I'd really like.
is this best in like ebook form or three-dimensional form?
I started with the book because it's not available on iBooks, and
Ah,
then ultimately I found myself wanting to read it so frequently that I broke down and bought the Kindle edition because there is a Kindle edition, and
okay.
so it's
Well, I'll
one
have
of
to
my.
check that out. That's a strong recommendation. I mean, it gives me the same tingles that this book I recommend all the time I read maybe like 2 years ago now called Moral Mazes, which is this sociological study of large corporations in the late 70s and early 80s. And it kind of focuses on the middle management and senior management and really kind of like figures out like, so what exactly are you doing here and why are you doing it? And it was like I was like deep in my my short tenure at Dell, and it was like an extremely helpful book to read as far as just understanding how big companies work. More importantly, understanding how people who work in big companies operate. So that's a
Yeah, I
good one.
think I mean, just if you want to read the kind of condensed version, John's blameless postmortems
Mm,
article is basically like when you read Behind Human Error, it's like, here's where John got a lot of his stuff, but he's kind of applied it. I mean, he's the one who recommended the book. It's not like he's trying to take the ideas, but he's applying it to the domain of web operations. But it's really just generally about the problem of how do people react to, or how do organizations react to failure, and what is a good approach if you actually want to get better as opposed to get worse or just kind of stagnate.
right.
And it's just really really enlightening and really a wonderful book. There's a book that's a little bit simpler that's related called The Field Guide to Understanding Human Error by Decker. So if you want something between the Blameless Postmortems blog entry and the Behind Human Error book, that might be a good choice.
All right. Well, I'll put links to both of those in the show notes. And with that, as always, we're at underdevelopment.io, and we've got a feed you can subscribe to. And if you like this podcast, it'd be great if you recommended it to your friends. That would be handy. We've been getting lots of good feedback recently. Bill was just tweeting to someone before we recorded here, and so it always means a lot to hear from you guys, and also if we got to get our NPS score up. Speaking of management consulting, and so recommend it to people. That'd be great.
Yep, and send feedback.
Yeah. So with that, we'll see everyone next time.